record on this computer, so we are recording. Yep.
Micah will be proud.
Yeah, Micah will be proud. He'll be on in just a little bit. Lord God, as we hear these prophets speak to us, may we hear them speak to us. May we recognize that their word was not meant to be limited to a certain time and space, but then in fact, it was meant as your word, meant to encourage us, to bring us under the scrutiny of your care, but also to give us hope. May we hear that as we converse with Amos and Micah and Hosea and Isaiah tonight. In Jesus, amen.
Amen.
Did you catch that? We're going to go through Amos, Micah, Hosea, and Isaiah. You've read them all, right? So
No, long time ago.
a long time ago. Well,
Yeah.
and I will reiterate, this is definitely an overview. And tonight we will be doing an overview of the prophets themselves. I want to make sure that as I share the screen here, I'm going to go towards Unit 21. You should see the screen. What happened? Oh, I stopped it. That's what I did. Let's do it again. I wanted to do this. I have to start from current slide. You may not be able to see this too well, but remember you can come back to the video and the video that I'll send out. My apologies for sending out this last week's just today. I should have sent it out much earlier. I'll try to even send it out tonight if I can get it downloaded fast enough. Or up, no, this is uploaded. I got to get it uploaded. We are in the time of the prophets, but let me go through some history again. It's good to get a snapshot of the history of how Israel is set up. We've already gone through, of course, Genesis and up to Joseph being in Egypt. We went through Moses somewhere around 2000 BC. Well, no, somewhere around 1500 BC. Moses brought people out of Egypt to the promised land. There's Micah. And Micah, I already started recording because Judy said, don't forget to stop recording. So, and Moses brought the people out of their exodus, gave them the covenant. We, in our third session, studied what covenants were about. This is a major key, even to understanding the prophets, because the prophets will be bringing a lawsuit against the people of Israel on behalf of God based on the covenant. And they are called berit. A berit is a lawsuit, but berit is also the word for covenant. So when God is picking a jury, he picks a jury for his trial against Israel, breaking the covenant. He notably picks the jury from among the stars, and may the heavens recognize what has happened, or among the other nations. This is what I've done with my people, but they broke my covenant. They broke my marriage with them, is what Hosea says. And the prophets are written in the form of covenant lawsuits, which sometimes makes it, I don't know how many of you love to sit down at night and read a lawsuit, that comes from, just sit down and read legal technical work. It's not necessarily the most interesting thing. And that's why the prophets are sometimes hard for us to get into. A lot of times we jump into one line of the lawsuit rather than seeing the whole covenant itself. Well, Moses set this up with the covenants that were established, notably in the book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and then a retelling of that in Deuteronomy. as well as consequences if you don't follow the covenant. Deuteronomy said this is what the consequences will be. We then go through 500 years of history, actually even longer than that, of the people forgetting the covenant. They were told to remember, and what do? They forget. Through the book of Judges, through all the books of Samuel, we see that they forget that they should not need a king, but they clamor for a king anyway. They get their greatest king in their history is David, but even David violates the covenant in terms of irresponsibility. That's the charge that is brought against him. We lift that up as adultery, but adultery was just one aspect of it. And then from David on, even though there's a promise to David, another covenant is made. I will have a king out of the house of David. I will have a king that will fulfill my covenant. David violates the covenant. We watch the denouement, the downhill slide of all of the kings, including a civil war that breaks Israel into somewhere around 800 BC, 800 years before Christ, breaks Israel into two nations. The southern kingdom, which is two tribes of that, is called Judah, or the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom, which has 10 tribes, is called the northern kingdom, or later on when they pick up their capital, Samaria becomes their name. The northern kingdom doesn't have a temple, but that doesn't mean that God forgets them. The northern kingdom is sent prophets, 3 of whom we're going to be looking at tonight, that are going to be proclaiming, don't forget, or please remember your covenant. Remember the covenant that God called you. It's not located in the temple. It's located in the word of God being given to you. Later on, Jeremiah is going to say, and that's next week, Jeremiah is going to say, it would be so much better if that word was not just written in their head or on stone, but it was written in their heart, that finally maybe the people would remember. And the promise will be that God will write it in their heart. So we have a number of non-literary prophets. That just means that they never wrote any books that we know of. I've got my little arrow up here speaking to the northern kingdom, Israel, where Ahijah, Jehu, Elijah, and Elisha were the most famous. I did want you to note they are to the northern kingdom. So lest you think that because they neglected the temple, they were considered bad. That's not the way God viewed them, because God sent prophets to them until the northern kingdom, and we took them last year, up to the point of where the northern kingdom finally collapsed. And why do I lose my arrow? There it is again, okay. In 721 BC. Nod your heads if you can see me pointing to that, 721. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
All right, 721. That's going to be 200 years almost before the southern kingdom collapses to the Babylonians. And we're going to have a number of prophets that will speak to them. But tonight we're going through Amos, Hosea, Micah is in here too. And then Micah is a southern kingdom prophet at the very end, just before Samaria, or just before northern kingdom collapses, and just as a time that the southern kingdom kind of regroups. So that's just to give you some history background. But we are looking at let me say, these are the prophets who are pre-9/11 for Israel. You know, 9/11 being the collapse of Israel, in 721 BC. You have to imagine with the Assyrians coming in, we'll hear more about them. What do these prophets say? And I gave you homework last week. Let me go out of this. I'm going to move to chapter 22. So I'm going to stop sharing this. Sorry for pausing because I have to think through, what am I doing here? Okay. Did I do that right? I don't think I did. No, because I put that onto my whole screen. So I'm going to exit that. And I closed out the whole unit. So let me open the unit again. Diminish it. Go back to my Zoom. Back to the Zoom meeting. I should have, I think I have to come out again. Well, I could probably do it through this. Here, I thought I practiced this. Okay, it should show up now on my screen. I do not see it.
Can you click the?
Oh, there it is. I do see it. Yeah, I do see it there. Okay. Got it. Okay, you should see. Yep. Okay. So last week, I left you with a little bit of a mission after we talked about the prophets, namely, how would you speak if you're seeking to encourage people, the conscience of a people who are financially comfortable, even in luxury, like a wealthy congregation? How would you speak to people who are unaware or not paying attention to the growing gap between the rich and the poor? How would you speak when people consider their land as something that they deserve rather than something that's inherited? How would you speak when courts can be easily persuaded, bought, or influenced towards preferential justice? How would you speak when there's corruption on governmental levels? How would you speak on religious levels when the speakers for God are saying whatever pleases the people, actually brings in the money and donations, and gives comfortable proclamations? When judicial authorities are bought, how do you preach when people are considered customers or commodities? And last week, I think somebody said, that sounds like preaching today. There are some very strong similarities. How does the prophet help people see their spiritual sickness? And I ask you, what irritates God? Tonight, we're going to start seeing this, and I'm going to ask you some questions, but you may want to turn to the book of Amos. Not may want to, I want you to turn to the book of Amos. Don't ask me why the books are not in chronological order in the Bible. They were just placed in strange orders, notably for we call minor prophets. They're actually all called prophets in the Jewish canon, in the Jewish Bible, but we call them minor only because their books are smaller. But actually, sometimes the minor prophets had more clout. They had a lot to say. And Amos was in particular one who had a lot of clout. And he also had a nifty way of putting things, although Amos's message, and we are going to do an overview. You could come back and look at Amos, maybe in conjunction with some of the stuff that I'm saying tonight. We're going to walk through the book of Amos. But Amos starts with a most famous sermon. Now, Amos is from Tekoa, which is 16 miles south of Jerusalem. Judah, this is the southern kingdom. This is the This is the kingdom that we tend to look at and say, well, they must have had it better because they had Jerusalem. But Amos feels the calling as a shepherd and a prophet in some way to go to the northern kingdom. And at one point, they're going to say, shepherd, why don't you go back to your own place? You don't have a union card as a prophet, you know? They don't like what he's going to say, but he gets a call to go to Bethel and to Samaria to preach his message. He's going to the northern kingdom at this point, even though they were starting to look at their own demise, they were richer than their southern neighbors. They were on the well-traveled route between Assyria and Babylon and Egypt. So a lot of money was coming into Israel, and they had some really neat arrangements with, let's see if I can get this map back up here, with Phoenicia, so that there was good, way up here to the upper left, Israel was having its heyday. The Dow Jones was up pretty high. Everything was going good for them, better than it was for Judah, the little southern kingdom. But Judah had a little more comfortable security. Amos is preaching 100 years before Israel is going to fall, but he's preaching to a group of people that are, there's a number of people that are predominantly comfortable because they've managed to get the security of their wealth. That's what this picture of this woman is, with not just a mask on. That's a pretty fancy mask that she's wearing. At the same time, there's an incredible poverty that's going. We've got the separation of the wealth and the poor. And the wealth are living in isolation. The wealthy are living in isolation from those that are impoverished in the same country. And there are injustices that are happening in the northern kingdom. If I get back to my map here. So Amos comes up, and you have to remember Amos is coming from, it's kind of like having somebody come from Texas to go preach at Washington, D.C. How well do you think that the message is going to be heard by the Washingtonians, by the D.C. Population from somebody from Texas? Amos is coming up and he has to preach a sermon. His sermon, his first sermon, is phenomenal, because what he does is he starts to say in a rhetorical language that would have been understood at the time. For 3 transgressions and for 4. Dusty, do the math. What's 3 plus 4? 7. 7 in Bible talk is that's enough. How many days do we have in a week? 7.
7.
Okay, yeah. 7 is a sign of completion. So he starts off with this rhetorical thing for 3 transgressions and for 4. So the listeners are going, okay, for 7 transgressions, they can do the math. Yeah, they don't have to have what do you call it, an abacus to try and figure it out at this point. And then who are you talking about for 3 transgressions and for 4? So he names first one of the nasty enemies of Israel for 3 transgressions and for 4 up in Damascus. I'm in verse 3 of chapter 1. God says, I'm going to destroy you guys because you really did a bad land grab of Gilead. You took some of Israel's turf. You can hear the crowd listening to Amos going, hey, nice job preaching that, Amos, So Amos goes on, and notice at verse 6, we have, this is what the Lord says. For 3 sins of Gaza. Okay, Gaza is Philistia. For 3 transgressions. And notice on the map, Gaza is at the other side. He's gone down to the bottom neighbor of Israel. For 3 transgressions, I'm gonna smash you, says God, because you're involved in slave trade. The people of Israel are going, yeah, go after our southern neighbors, you know? That's right. God should go after them. So you get the sense now Amos is moving on. Who's going to be his third target? Well, his third target is Phoenicia up in verse 9. He goes against Phoenicia for three sins of for three sins of Tyre, which is up in, that's one of the capitals of Phoenicia, you know, because what you guys have done is the same thing as the Philistines. You've used people, you've traded people. Now Amos is becoming a little popular. He's probably got all sorts of Facebook time. You know, people are going, you got to come listen to this prophet, you know, and then he comes up against Edom. Notice how he's done this crisscross. He's gone from here to here, from here to here, you know, going against all the people, you know, the fourth one, he talks about the Edomites who are kind of kissing cousins of the Israelites. And he says, what you guys have done is dealt brutally with the people of Jacob. This is in verses 11 and 12. Couple verses for them, and he moves on to the Ammonites. And he says, you know what, you grabbed land from the Transjordan. Transjordan is everything beyond the, well, notice what country belongs in Transjordan, Israel. You grabbed land from Israel. You stole some of Israel's land. How do you think the Israelites would like Amos's preaching now, you know? Then he goes against the southern neighbor. We got 6. Notice how many times he's going to say for 3 transgressions and for 4. He's going to say it 7 times. So we're waiting for who's the 7th one he's going to come against. Well, I think you can guess, but first we have to go against Moab in 6, and then 7, we're going against Judah. Amos charges the southern kingdom with being disobedient to God. This is the group of people that had the temple and had a king that was a legitimate king of David. And Amos says, you guys were unfaithful to God. You know, Judah would beg to differ, but the Israelites would go, the northern kingdom would go, yes, preach on Amos. You're getting those guys. Those are the guys that broke off from us. And now finally Amos comes, by the time we get to the end, finally Amos comes to the people he's preaching to. It's a good rule of thumb. If you're going to preach to a congregation, preach about all the enemies first, then preach at them, okay? And Amos comes at Israel and says, for 3 transgressions and for 4. Now he goes on for almost a whole chapter. And actually he comes up with a law case against Israel. And what he charges them with is several things. Look at chapter 2, we're in chapter 2, verses 6 through 8. I'm going to ask if, Margine, would you read 6 through 8 for us?
I unmuted me.
You did. You are good.
Okay. Because of the 3 great sins of Israel, make that 4. I'm not putting up with them any longer. They buy and sell upstanding people. People for them are only things, ways of making money. They'd sell a poor man for a pair of shoes. They'd sell their own grandmother. They grind the penniless into the dirt, shove the luckless into the ditch. Everyone and his brother sleeps with the sacred whore, a sacrilege against my holy name. Stuff they've extorted from the poor is piled up at the shrine of their God, while they sit around drinking wine they've conned from their victims.
Okay, that's got to be the Message translation.
It is.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That's delightful. Okay, all right. What are the charges that are brought against Israel? And anybody can unmute or just say, what are some of the things that he's saying they've done? All the same things he's told the other people, but here he's even more specific. What have they done with the poor?
Trample on their
They
head.
sold people are bought and sold, okay? And not only are they attending the shrines of the false gods, but father and son are, participating with the same whore out of this shrine, and it's being taught to the children. It's being done from one generation to another. Anything else that's in there? They take garments as a pledge. It's what I have at the first half of verse 8. The law of Moses says explicitly, you may take a garment from somebody as a collateral for something, but you make sure you give it back at night. You make sure you don't take something that will keep them comfortable, but you take the garment only during the day. Here, they're taking the garment as a pledge, and then they're going home and just drinking wine that they receive from fines of other people, getting themselves blitzed in order to just kind of ignore the plight of the people around them. That's some of the first of the charges that are brought by Amos. Then he says, look at verse 10, and you'll see at verse 10, he starts into the way a covenant usually is remembered. God says, I brought you, I did this for you, but you forgot. That's the lawsuit. I did this, I brought you out of Egypt, I led you, I raised prophets from among your sons, as well as sacred priests or Nazarites from among your young people, but you made the sacred priests, you made them unsacred, unholy, just by getting them drunk. So I'm going to crush you, says God, and you're not going to be able to defend yourself. That's part of what Isaiah says in this covenant lawsuit.
You did yourself. John, you're muted.
Mute. I don't know how I did that.
Space bar, maybe.
I don't know. Okay, I'll go back to the chapter here. Yeah. Go down to the slide that I was at. Okay, we'll call this up, but I'm going to run through, and you may want to just take a look at the charges that are brought against Israel. Okay, are we back up?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and I'll come to that slide in just a second. Because in chapters 3 through 1, he accuses them in chapter 4, verse 2 through 3. He's rather explicit. It's almost like he's reading a newspaper. Chapter 4, verse 2 through 3, he says, you guys, the time is going to come when you're going to be taken by fish hooks. You're going to be going outside. Now, this is 100 years before the Assyrians will come and conquer the nation. How well do you think that Amos was heard? How well do you think a prophet would be heard if we were to say today, watch out, the Russians are going to come and take us away. And you are not going to be able to escape. Amos is going to be charged with treason, for treasonous talk. And he's going to, the prophet is going to say that, is going to say in 4 verse 1, it's actually a humorous thing. Hear this, you cows of Bashan on Mount Samaria, you women who oppress the poor and crush the needy, and say to your husbands, bring us some more to drink. The sovereign Lord is sworn by his holiness. Okay, what kind of a picture do you get here? It's a rather, I think the prophet is, I don't think he's very popular. You know, when he's talking about this type of problem happening in Israel, and in fact, he keeps talking all the way through chapter 5, verse 17. He talks about this judgment that's going to come upon Israel, even to the point in 5, verse 2, where he says it's going to be like a death. And then he goes into a funeral song, which we would call a dirge. It translates pretty well into English. I'm going to almost chant it the way it should be read. We would look at it, fallen is virgin Israel. Actually, it should be read like this. Fallen is virgin Israel, never to rise again, deserted in her own land, with no one to lift her up. It's just, in the Hebrew, it comes off as a song that would not have made it into the top 10 of the popular songs of Israel during that time. But sometimes putting a song like that makes it something that people apparently remembered. And that's why Amos was remembered, because he sang these words. Well, then people came back and said, we believe in the day of the Lord. This is the first time that you hear the reference to the day of the Lord in the prophets, a big concept that will make it all the way into Jesus's talk. So this next slide that I'm going to show you is the sequence of the history of the talk of the day of the Lord. That at this point, the people are coming back to Amos and saying, the day of the Lord is coming, when we know that everybody is going to look at us as God's chosen people. And they are going to bring all sorts of wealth to us. That's what this is, a money bag. That camels are going to come, that the ships are going to come to Israel and prove that God considers us his favored people. Amos is the first one to turn it upside down and say, you got it wrong. The day of the Lord is a day of judgment. You're going to find that the day of the Lord is thinking you're escaping a lion on one side, and you're going to be running from the lion, and suddenly you're going to find yourself in the mouth of a bear, that a bear is on the other side. The day of the Lord is a day of judgment. And the judgment is not going to come on all those other nations. The judgment is going to come on you, because you are God's favored people. But he does not want to see you dismiss his favorability. Later on, the prophet Jeremiah will talk about the day of the Lord, and he'll reverse it once again. He's going to say, the day of the Lord is going to come when everybody who's picked on Israel and Judah is going to face judgment. And Jeremiah writes this on a scroll so that it can be kept. But then he tells his secretary, Baruch, take the scroll. People should not hold on to this, because they're going to misuse this prophecy that the day of the Lord is going to come, that God is going to bring favor, his love back to his people. Baruch, take this scroll and go and throw it into a river and help us remember, or bury it and help us remember where it was. The day of the Lord is going to come. This language is going to be remembered when we get into talk about Messiah. When people are talking about a Messiah is going to come to help bring Israel back to what it was intended to be, or we're going to fulfill the law, so God will have to bring a Messiah so that the rest of the nations will come to us. The story of Jesus turns the day of the Lord upside down again, because Jesus does have the nations come to him with all of their wealth. Can you think of when that happens? The wise men who are coming with camels with gold and frankincense and myrrh, when the nations are coming to Jesus. And Jesus himself is going to handle the judgment of the day of the Lord when he is, we're going to hear it in this Sunday's gospel lesson, when he is finally lifted up. When is Jesus lifted up? On the cross. The day of the Lord. And when Jesus talks about Judgment Day, he's talking about the day of the Lord. He does all of his conversation about the day of the Lord, not after he's risen from the dead. He does it the week of his going to the cross. Jesus is pointing invariably to the day of the Lord being that cross event. And then everything else is a fulfillment from that. Finally, we come to when Jesus talks about the day of the Lord. And the day of the Lord is going to be, according to Jesus, the servant king living out the true role of a God who recognizes people as needing to be loved by the God who loves us, and serving people. Jesus is going to talk about how that servant king of the judgment day is manifest in society all along. Jesus will take the Amos talk, where Amos says, you have forgotten the poor and you have forgotten those who are in need. You've thought the day of the Lord was for you, but the day of the Lord happens every day. Jesus is going to take in his most famous sermon, he's going to, when people are coming to Judgment Day, and they're going to be separated into sheep and goats. And Jesus is going to say, those of you you didn't help me when I was hungry, or when I was lonely, or when I was sick, or when I was imprisoned, or you did not help me. And they say, we didn't see you. And he said, very truly, even as you did it, not to the least of these, my brethren, you did it not also to me. But the sheep will have seen Judgment Day happens all the time. Okay, that's a major theme in Amos that gets picked up by other prophets. But the prophet Amos does pick up. I want you to turn to 5 verse 4. And we get one major positive. We got a whole bunch of negatives from Amos. What have we not done? But just before verse 5, you should have something like 4 words that become Amos's primary message. Kate, do you want to read it? Well, seek me and live. Yep. Do justice is another thing that Amos keeps coming up with. Probably one of the more famous statements of Amos is that justice is going to roll down the mountains. It is going to somehow come to that day of the Lord when God's justice truly comes and happens. I'm going to skip over this portion. There are a number of neat visions that Amos has, but all of them are visions of justice, justice of the locusts, justice of the fire. At those points, Amos says, oh, Lord, have mercy. God says, okay, I will. But finally, God holds up a plumb line in Amos's vision. Amos sees the plumb line is showing that the whole house of Israel is teetering to the side, it's falling over. No longer, he sees a basket of ripe fruit, and God says, Israel is ripe for the picking. It just is, it's going to collapse, that they're going to go into their house for safety or into their temple for safety, and it's going to collapse. That's Amos's judgment. But what irritates God? I put down the list for you. And this is not in your book. So let's read through these. Okay, sister, you want to start? Can you read the first one? Hypocrisy, Mike? Yep. Okay. The needy are oppressed. The needy are forgotten. Okay. Gary, can you read after courts unjust?
Self-centeredness.
We don't have a problem with that, or the next one today, do we? Okay. I see, she's trying to hide, but I see Stephanie. Oh, there we go. Okay, you get the next one.
Narcissism.
Yeah, okay. They didn't have that word back in the biblical times, but I think we can claim that's it. Okay, let's see, I've got Margine next.
Lack of compassion.
Yeah, okay. Mike, I've got you next.
Disobedience to God's law.
And
Covetous.
yeah, and covetous. And then Verla, are you able to read that one on the upper right there?
We become oblivious to the law and our responsibilities.
Excellent. Barb?
Extortion and bribery.
And then Laura.
Treating people as valueless.
Okay, now does this surprise you as the irritants? I think usually we tend to look at the prophets and we tend to think, well, they're going to speak out against adultery, or they're going to speak out against some other violation. They're going to speak out against killing and murder, or they're going to speak out against bribery comes up here. But this is the list, and we're going to add to it too as we get into the next prophet. And like I said, I'm moving fairly fast, and you can come back and look over all these prophets and see. I think I'm up to 43. Skip that slide because we already had it. Okay, now we're going to get to a prophet that tells the word a little differently. Amos was 100 years before Israel started to collapse. Hosea, the next prophet in line, was actually just before Israel collapsed under the Assyrians. And he had to preach during a time, Hosea had to preach and say that God's covenant was broken, that the covenant that Israel had made. And he reminds, Hosea is the one who picks up a new analogy for God's relationship with Israel. It was a marriage that happened back in ancient Israel. Back when they were at Sinai, that was a marriage that happened between God and Israel. And that covenant was actually something akin to our vows. You shall have no others. You shall make sure you use the name of God appropriately. You shall have time with God. Make sure that you respect the relationship, that you respect the authorities within the relationship, that you take care of each other, and that you not live with a covetous attitude of wishing you were something out there. Hosea picked up this language that helps us see this is love language. And Amos picked up justice language. Hosea picks up another thread of God has loved his people, but they have betrayed that love. It's a marvelous, and it is a sad, it's actually a country western song, Hosea, where it would go, my wife broke up with me. She ran off with all the goods. She ran off with the house. How am I going to get her back? Hosea tells the story, and he tells the story through his own life, because God encourages Hosea, or tells Hosea, I want you to go out and marry a prostitute. Marry somebody who has a potential of being unfaithful. And Hosea says, okay. So he goes and he marries Gomer. And he marries Gomer, and he has actually he has a couple of kids, but before the marriage has even fallen apart, she's already had kids by some other folks, and Hosea ends up taking care of them. And she runs out, and actually Hosea is about to separate from her, and God says, no, I want you to go get her back. Even though you have every right to just say, this is not a legitimate marriage, I want you to go get her back. Hosea kind of asks the question, why? And God whispers to him, because this is what I have to keep doing with my people. They're busy having a relationship with everybody else. They're busy finding their fruitfulness and everything else in the world. But they're running out on me. But I love them. That's Hosea's message in a nutshell. And Hosea is having to tell them this at the same time that he's announcing, Israel, northern kingdom, you are on the verge of finding yourself living as though you are divorced, as though you are separated from me. Because Israel, you are going to go in chains to the Assyrians. I need to go back a couple of slides because one thing that wasn't told, you see all of these during the time that Hosea was preaching, for the 25 years that Hosea was probably preaching, Israel went through 5 assassinations of kings in 25 years. What do you think happened to that rich nation of Israel when they had such a political climate? The economy began to fall apart. You'll notice the shadows on the top. Hosea mentions that people were busy clubbing one another in order to find, they were not loving, they were clubbing. And I'm not talking about going out to the clubs. I'm talking about they were beating one another. There was a brutality that just picked up in Israel at that point. And Hosea goes on in his prophecies to talk about the day of the Lord in another way. He says that Israel is living, there's too many people that are living sheltered from this, thinking somehow that because they have some wealth, they're immune from all of this. But what's going to happen is they're trusting in their swords, they're trusting in their alliances. And in fact, we're going to hear about some of those alliances in Isaiah, where Isaiah says, watch out, Judah, you're making false alliances, thinking that somehow you can trust some of these neighboring kingdoms. And Israel even ends up making alliances with Assyria, who are the worst neighbors on the block. But because Assyria is the strongest, Israel thinks, if we make an alliance with Assyria, they'll protect us from our lesser bad neighbors. So Assyria comes in and says, that's great. Yeah, we'll make an alliance with you, but you're going to pay us a big tribute. And suddenly they become vassals. They become vassal kingdoms to Assyria. And when they start to complain about it 10 years later, we're paying too high in the taxes, oh, Assyria. Assyria comes in and says, enough, you're done. And that's when Assyria wipes them out. And Assyria does its sting. But going back, Hosea promises, your alliances and the treaties that you've made are based on falsehoods in terms of who you're trusting. You are like a dove that's just going to be captured in the net, and a leopard is going to come and devour you. That's Hosea's prophecy that Israel will be left no more. Assyria does come, does conquer them, does conquer the nation, and when it conquers, it wipes out Israel. It takes the wealthy, the most powerful and elite by, as I said, the fish hooks through the nose, connecting them with other people and moving them to other countries. So it robs the nation of any potential of being able to find some sense of order, to be able to even rebel against it. There's just no chance when they've been decimated. Actually, it's more, decimated means 10%. They've been what, septimated, 7 times the number have been taken out. We don't know if Hosea lived long enough to see it. Hosea is about the last of the prophets of the pre-9/11 date in Israel. He has to name some children. The Crossways material goes into some marvelous explanation of how the prophets had to, when they had some kids or when they were around some kids, they had to name their kids kind of like you would place a billboard out in front of your house. I want you to name, Hosea, I want you to name one of your kids Jezreel, which actually just means God's going to sow. He's going to sow problems into your land. And I'll tell you what, name your second kid Lo Ruhamah, or name your kid No Pity. How would you like to name a kid No Pity? And then the devastating one, name the people Lo Ami, not my people. They've declared themselves not my people. Isaiah is going to do that too. Isaiah is going to name his children. He's going to have a little more hope. He's going to have hope that God is going to bring someone to return. So he names his first child Sheir Yashub, a remnant shall return. Second child we know, the second child that he names is what?
Emmanuel.
Emmanuel. That's the famous Isaiah 7 prophecy. We tend to look at it just as Jesus. It isn't just as Jesus. It is actually during Isaiah's time that there's some child, Emmanuel. God still is with us. It's not God will be with us someday, but God is with us. And then here I name any of you. I'd love for any of you to name your next cat. Mahir Shalal Hashbaz, that's a great name to have. Mahir Shalal Hashbaz. Let's all say it together. Mahir Shalal Hashbaz. Yeah. The spoil speeds, the prey hastes. Judgment is coming. Judgment is coming. So name your kid. Okay, yeah, injustice. Okay. All right. So let's go to, okay, I'm gonna skip through this, stop sharing here. Because I do want to get through, I want to have Micah lead us in Micah, Micah, did your parents name you for a reason?
Yeah, because I think the biggest part is probably the desire for Micah 6:8 to be part of my life.
Okay, we will have you read Micah 6:8 when we get there. Okay, so if you can find the little prophet Micah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum is the order. Micah is one of the prophets of the southern kingdom, but at the same time that the northern kingdom is about to fall, he comes before Isaiah, but he actually forges some things. Now, I'm going to have to, again, for the sake of abbreviation, did I skip through? No, I did. Well, yeah, I skipped down to chapter 25. I need to go back to, I'll go back to 24 in a little bit. I'm in chapter 25, but in Micah, okay, Micah is one who's going to, he's going to help us remember how these covenants are set up. He's setting a covenant, berit, a lawsuit against now Judah, the southern kingdom, and saying, watch out. And that covenant has to start with a whereas, or actually, yeah, whereas God has brought you out of Egypt. He brought you out of captivity. He gave you the covenant and made you the people, and he brought you into the land. Whereas you have violated this covenant. And although God showed mercy to you, this is Micah's big word, mercy. We've had justice from Amos. We've had love from Hosea. Now we have mercy from Micah. It's as though these prophets, preachers have heard each other and they start to pick each other's messages up, but then they give them a little bit of nuance. In this case, it's as God showed you mercy and took care of you, you were supposed to show mercy to others, but you haven't. You've dispossessed people. You've pushed them out, and you've pushed them into you've seized lands from others, put them into debt, rather than remembering what the covenant said about various debts that you're supposed to have. You've turned religious rituals into just rituals. They don't bring your heart back to God. It's just do some rituals to somehow get God on your good side. So you sacrificed countless lambs and sheep, but you haven't done anything in terms of justice. It's all been meaningless rituals that have happened. Micah really hammers the misuse of the priesthood, and he comes out with his famous. Actually, let's go to Micah 6:8. And actually, we're going to start. And Micah, I'm going to have you read starting at 6:6. And notice how 6:6 starts first with kind of the people's questions. Oh, what can we do to get on God's good side? And then it comes to, it comes all the way through to what does God actually require? What does he want? So Micah, if you'd read 6:6 through 6:8, we'll give you the honors in the prophet's name.
Oh, thank you. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings of calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God?
If you have a chance, circle that verse in your Bible or highlight it or remember it. There is the summary of the prophets up to this point. What does God actually want? Okay, Amos said, do you remember, Kate? Seek God and live. And then later on, do justice. Now Hosea said, love kindness, love the mercy of God. Now comes Micah, and he throws in that third phrase, walk humbly with God. Don't try to bribe God with everything that you can. He wants you to walk in humility with him. I wish I could say more about Micah. We don't have time. I'll tell you what, Micah, I'll put your phone number on, and everybody can call Micah if you want to know more about Micah. Okay. And now we go to Micah's brother, who is Micah. What's your brother's name?
Isaiah.
Isaiah. So we go back a chapter to Isaiah. And actually, we're just talking Isaiah 1 through 39. And we're actually just going to spend a few minutes on Isaiah. We'll do more next time with Isaiah, but this is actually in chapter 24.
Isaiah 2, right?
Well, actually, we're going to go to Isaiah 6. Which is, there's 25, 25, 23, 24. There it is. Okay. And Isaiah 6, where does it take place? In the temple. So this gives you a hint that what was Isaiah's first occupation, possibly? A priest, not a prophet, a priest. Because it's while he's doing priestly duty in Isaiah 6. And we get the way that the Bible dates things. In the year that King Uzziah died, that'd be like me saying, in the year, let's see, I was born in the year that we engaged in the war in Korea. So some of you here could say about what year that was.
51.
1950. Yeah, I was 1950. Okay. Give me the year that you were born, Kate. Huh? 2003. Okay. My goodness, you were born 2 years after 9/11. You're young. In the year of President Bush's second term. Okay.
Which one?
Which month?
Bush.
Oh yeah, which one? President W. Bush's second term. All right, Gary, that puts you up there. When were you born? Give me some dating thing.
I was born the day they ended the Korean War, July 27, 1953.
There we go. Oh my goodness. Okay. All right. So here's the year King Uzziah died. I saw the Lord high and seated on a throne. Okay. Wait a second. He's in the temple. And the Lord is where? Seated on a throne, not on the Ark of the Covenant. Okay. The whole vision is an expansion of the temple, as though the temple isn't big enough to hold this God. Here's this priest who's thinking he has to serve God, but now he's seeing not just God. Who else is he seeing? Seraphs that are flying around the place with wings all over, and they're calling to one another. What?
Holy, holy, holy.
Yeah, holy, 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 which now the priest who is going to turn into the prophet, the priest's reaction is what? Woe is me. In other words, the priest who's supposed to be able to serve this God and supposed to do all priestly duty, how does he feel? There's no way. he feels inconsequential. And then he realizes it's not just me. I am a man with what? It's important to hear this. What does he say he has?
Unclean lips.
Unclean lips. Does this sound a little bit like Moses? I have a speech impediment. I can't say anything. Woe is me. And not only me, I live among a bunch of people that they just don't know how to speak. Does God let him off the hook? No. A seraph comes and does what? There it is up here, live coal, and touches his lips. And the very thing that he hears at this point first is absolution. Your guilt has been taken away. Your sin has been atoned for. What, by some special sacrifice in the temple? No, this is a gift of God. What I want you to hear is Isaiah is in a very subtle way, he's talking against a temple system that has become or is becoming just a self-preserving sacrificial system. And the prophet is saying, my call says my priesthood is bigger than this. And God's justice is bigger than this. That God is able to touch or atone for us in God's own time. But then he hears the voice that says, okay, this comes out of some of our favorite, one of our favorite hymns, "Here I am, Lord," but in fact, it's always an answer to a question, "Whom shall I send?" And then we sing, "Here I am, Lord.
Lord.
Is it I, Lord? I have called you." But notice what the prophet is called to do. Go and tell his people. To tell his people, what does he have to use? He becomes the mouthpiece, okay? The prophet is told, you are now the mouthpiece. But not only that, you're going to preach to people who aren't going to understand the thing you're saying, who are never going to be able to hear it clearly. They're going to find their heart is hardened and calloused. Their ears are going to get deaf. Their eyes are going to get closed. Otherwise, they may see with their eyes. So here, I want you to preach to them. How many of you would say, "Oh yeah, Lord, I want to take that as a job." I want to take that as a calling. Okay. Well, actually, what he says at verse 11 is, what does he say? I don't know if Judy can unmute herself that fast. What does he say, Judy?
Am I muted?
No, you guys aren't muted.
You aren't. You're on speaker.
Oh. For how long?
When does this call end? And God answers, when it's all come tumbling down. When the judgment, in other words, he's going to have to preach a message of judgment. Okay, we're going to end with Isaiah right there. There's a bunch of good things in the Isaiah. We won't get a chance to talk about the Emmanuel prophecy, which is the one we tend to go towards. But I do want to see you look at, I've changed the question, do you notice? From what irritates God to what grieves God. And when we add Hosea and Isaiah, we get, I'm going to read them off because these are pretty small. Injustice, unfaithfulness, murder, lying, no conscience, adulterers, corrupting what God intended, lack of intimacy with God, lack of integrity, stealing. Priests are not the sources of knowledge. And there's a lack of faithfulness, a lack of justice, a lack of righteousness. They're judging by hearsay rather than the truth. We'll start with one of Isaiah's famous prophecies next week. And we will be going through Jeremiah. Who else are we going to hit? We really are going to skip through the prophets, but I want you to hear that underlying question. What are they preaching against? And what are they preaching? What are they preaching that God actually wants? But we'll get Jeremiah, a little bit of Zephaniah, Nahum, Habakkuk, and Ezekiel. We'll get into the exilic the exile prophets next week. And in the meantime, I am going to close off the recording session. And we will go into a moment of our prayers. So think while I'm closing off the recording, if there are some people that you'd like to pray for, I've got a couple that I will name. Stop recording.